Hi, class. This week we're studying feminist philosophy, and there have been two major goals in the feminist philosophical movement, which include consciousness raising. Feminist philosophers want to demonstrate how women have been oppressed and are currently oppressed. They not only want to help men see this, but they also want to help women see this. The second goal is liberation. That is, they want to help put an end to oppression. The ultimate goal is to achieve equality between men and women throughout the world. What feminists are ultimately battling against is patriarchy, which can be defined as a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. Overall, patriarchy has dominated societies and governments around the world. In Europe and America, patriarchy influences us on many, many subtle levels. Let's look at the history of Western philosophy, starting with ancient Greek philosophy. Aristotle argued that in reproduction, men carry the creative force and women are the receptacle. Further, Aristotle argued that women are misbegotten males or defective males. In other words, a human is born as a woman and not as a man due to a mistake in nature. And Plato and Aristotle held that men are rational and women are emotional and hysterical. And for this reason, philosophy and politics are best conducted by men. Interestingly, Plato's metaphysical theory of forms held that outside this world are eternal, timeless, changeless truths that we try to understand. So philosophers have characterized this world as the world of reason, objectivity, and emotional detachment, all considered to be characteristically male traits. And it's what we seek in philosophy. The earth is considered corrupt and only gives us illusions and bad copies of these truths, according to Plato's philosophy. The earth is often considered to be representative of characteristically female traits. So you can see that from the very foundation of Western philosophy, we have male bias. Let's look at Christianity. Early Christian philosophers make the same distinction. The earth is corrupt and flawed, while the heavens are perfect and unchanging. In Christian faith, God creates all people with a purpose, and so Aristotle's view that women are flawed men, it doesn't work. After all, God in his omnipotence wouldn't create a mistake. So women are not considered as defective men, but they are still inferior in body and mind. St. Augustine argued that the woman together with the man is the image of God, so that the whole substance is one image. But when she is assigned as a helpmate, which pertains to her alone, she is not the image of God. However, in what pertains to man alone, is the image of God just as fully and completely as he is joined with the woman into one. Also, God is characteristically depicted and described as a man. Jesus is a man, and all of Jesus' disciples are men. So, Mary Magdalene, who was a follower of Jesus and close to Jesus, was not included. Let's consider science. Feminists argue that scientific institutions have a long tradition of excluding women as practitioners. And also, as we will see in our week's reading and in this lecture, women are often excluded as the subjects of scientific inquiry. Feminists also argue that female subjects are treated in a way that reproduce gender normative stereotypes. That is, experiments are set up such that the conclusions that will be reached verify stereotypes about women. So the history of politics is also easily seen as patriarchal. In the US, women, of course, were excluded from voting for a long time, largely on the basis that they were considered, quote unquote, irrational, and so were untrustworthy voters. As only men had access to political power, they in turn only needed to represent the interests of men because They were the only ones who were voting. So let's now look at our week's reading and how gender might affect how we think. We'll start by contrasting psychology studies focus primarily on male subjects, and studies focus primarily on female subjects. So in the 1960s, psychologists were asking the question, what are the developmental stages of knowledge for a person? And the initial studies were focused on male subjects and predictably provided male-centric answers to that question. So Harvard psychologist William Perry outlined the following stages of development. The first, duality, where we believe knowledge is clear and unambiguous. There are right and wrong answers to every question, and typically the facts are known by authorities and experts. In other words, we can access the facts by looking outside of ourselves, towards these authorities and experts. The second stage is unacceptable multiplicity, where we realize that authorities often disagree with each other about what the facts are. Still, in this stage, we maintain that there is a right or wrong answer to each question, and so we figure that one authority is right and another is wrong, or that we just don't know the right answer yet. There's a rule in logic that supports these two stages of development known as the law of excluded middle. It holds that something can't be both X and not X. For instance, a table cannot be both brown and not brown at the same time. Or a plant can't be both growing and not growing at the same time. You can't have it both ways. You can't hold contradictory positions at once. The third stage is accepted multiplicity, where we realize that many questions don't have just one right answer. In this stage, we can tolerate differences of opinions among experts without discounting them or saying that all but one of them is wrong. For instance, we studied utilitarianism and deontology a few weeks ago, and you might have come out of that week thinking that expert utilitarian philosophers such as John Stuart Mill got something about morality right. And so did deontologists such as Immanuel Kant, even as they are opposed to each other. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist moral theory, and deontology is a non-consequentialist moral theory. But they both get something right. And then we reach relativism, where we stop looking to experts for truth, and we realize that truth and knowledge are not absolutes. They must be constructed to some degree by thinkers. And the convincing theories are those that are well supported with reasons and evidence. In other words, they're constructed very well. Now, a group of female psychologists in the 1980s that included Mary Field Belenky noted that Perry's subjects were men, and they set out to see what they would discover addressing the question with exclusively female subjects who had been excluded from that previous study. And they found differences. They broke up the stages of development differently. The first stage they found was received knowledge, which reflects Perry's duality. In this stage, knowledge is what an external authority says it is, and claims are either true or false. So this is basically the same starting point. But then we get something different. The second stage is subjective knowledge, where thinkers start to doubt the authority of external figures. Truth is considered to be personal, private, subjective, and intuitive. And the theory argues that women still think claims are true or false, and there are right answers, but the answers arise within individuals. In other words, subjects make themselves the authorities, rather than look outside themselves. With regard to intuition, truth and falsity will depend to some degree on whether the claim feels like it is true or false. Next, we have procedural knowledge, where women look for more objective and rational kinds of knowledge rather than such subjective knowledge. After all, our intuitions so often misguide us. So women in this stage start to appreciate different points of view and different ways of looking at issues. And at this point, women can go in one of two ways. Separate knowing, where the subject removes himself as much as possible and tries to derive truth impersonally. You can think of science as an impersonal study, as scientists try as much as possible to remove human influence and error from their controlled experiments. The goal is to derive hard facts through a process of being skeptical and looking for errors in one's thinking or theories. And this is not unlike Perry's stage of development. It's one way that women can go when they reach this third stage. But another way is very different. It's called connected knowing. This is where women draw from deeply personal knowledge that is hard to communicate and requires empathy, the feeling that comes with what it is like to be in someone else's shoes. And this means truth and information is learned through dialogue and discussion. Such dialogues will require trust and sophisticated emotional and intellectual abilities. So you listen, absorb, and process other people's feelings and ideas in order to come to objective understanding. This goal of objective understanding distinguishes this type of knowing from subjective knowledge. The idea is that you can learn truths about the world through connected knowing. And the fourth stage is constructed knowledge. This is the final stage where women integrate their strategies that they've worked on up through this point, and they become aware that there are two different approaches to knowledge, which include the objective, scientific, and rational. This characteristic of procedural knowing, and the subjective, intuitive, and emotional, which is characteristic of subjective knowing. So synthesizing these two means of understanding knowledge as constructed. That is, truth makes sense in context. It is supported by a theory and a point of view. So Descartes' arguments make sense from within the theory of Cartesian dualism, where the body and mind are totally distinct substances. From within that theory, it makes sense to question the reality of the world outside of our perceptions of it. Likewise, empiricism makes sense when you make the assumption that the mind is a blank slate that gets filled in when interacting with the world. So these epistemological theories that we studied last week, they wouldn't make sense to Plato or Socrates, who had different frameworks that guided their theories. So we can see in a sense that Descartes' theory and Locke's theory are constructed. So when comparing these two models for how men and women come to know things, we can see similarities. Both start with black and white thinking, in which they trust authorities. And they both end by recognizing that truth is constructed by thinkers to some degree. However, they differ in how they prioritize intuition and emotional distance. Perry's model does not consider intuition as relevant as a way of knowing. Feminists argue that this is a clear indicator that men don't value the experience of having a gut feeling or an intuition as far as knowledge is concerned. And because men are in charge, they have propped up the scientific method as the respected method for acquiring knowledge because it doesn't take into account things like gut feelings and intuitions. Moreover, men have argued that intuition is an inferior judge of what is right or wrong, or true or false. The other model holds that intuition is important in a person's development as a thinker, and it is not inferior, but just different than a more detached, impersonal approach. Also, Perry holds that emotional detachment is a virtue, whereas Belenki's model's highest rung involves constructed knowledge, which values the trust, empathy, and connectedness it took to learn and grow in understanding during the connected knowing phase. So whether it's biological or through social conditioning, it is clear that there is a difference between how men and women come to know something. And when we look at the history of Western philosophy, science, psychology, and other disciplines, which have been ruled by men historically, what is unique to how women acquire knowledge has been undermined and rejected. That is, namely, intuition and emotion as tools to understanding have been undermined and rejected. So we must ask ourselves, is this right? So an important theory in feminist epistemology is feminist standpoint theory. And this theory holds that knowers are situated. That is, they are situated in particular relations to what is known and to other knowers. So when someone expresses that they have knowledge, their claim also reflects their situation or perspective as a knower. For instance, people are affected by their emotions, attitudes, interests, and values. And we look at the world differently because of them. So for instance, as a simple example, a thief sees a lock as a frustrating obstacle, while the owner sees the lock as a comforting source of security. They have different goals. Now, feminists go further and argue that there are gendered emotions, attitude, interests, and values. So, androcentrism refers to typically male and masculine emotions, attitudes, interests, and values. For instance, a male interest is an interest a male has in virtue of the social roles he's assumed and is expected to occupy. So his attitudes are masculine when they align with attitudes that are considered socially appropriate to men. If a man calls a woman a babe or a whore, he reflects the androcentric attitude and the interests and values of single, heterosexual, adolescent men who view women in terms of their fantasized eligibility for sexual intercourse with them. That's how they're looking at women. The man is objectifying women from a situated vantage point in which his role in society and the way he's been socialized, his relationships with other men, and many more things that are unique to his situation are coloring his perspective. So the opposite is gynocentrism. This is when a woman, say, calls a man an eligible bachelor. This would reflect a gynocentric perspective of a heterosexual single woman interested in marriage. Again, the woman's perspective is situated and involves the influence of gender roles, gender norms, relationships with other men and women, and more. Now, feminist standpoint theory holds that people with particular socially situated perspective may have epistemic privilege or authority. In other words, their situation, which includes their embodiment, first-person experiences, emotions, attitudes, interests, values, know-how, cognitive style, worldview, and relations to other inquirers, gives them a privileged perspective. They might know or understand something important and truthful that someone coming from a different standpoint can't understand or access independently. Typically, we are not talking about analytic truths such as 2 plus 2 equals 4, but rather truths about socially and politically contested topics. For instance, women, as oppressed subjects, can access deep knowledge of society and its institutions over a more surface level knowledge. When women are oppressed in a country, they have direct experience of their oppression, unlike the men who are doing the oppressing. Men are privileged in such a society, and this enables them to ignore how their actions affect women. So this has situated women such that they have epistemic privilege. Women, as oppressed subjects, have the ability to see things from both the perspective of the dominant and from the perspective of the oppressed. and therefore can comparatively evaluate both perspectives. And this gives them a much deeper understanding of society, of justice, of levels of oppression, of consequences of oppression, of ethics, and more. Men don't have this rich, deep understanding because they aren't faced with the necessity of looking at the issues from the perspective of the oppressed. So they only see one side of it. They only need to see it from one side. So we can see how this played out in the case of Perry's study. He developed a lopsided, incomplete theory of the stages of human development because he was privileged and he needed only consider the issue from the standpoint of men. His role as a man and all that accompanies such a standpoint also gave him incentive, such as emotional incentive, to actually validate what he had always been conditioned to believe, that intuition and emotion have little to no role in the development of human intellectual development. Women, as oppressed subjects, could fully understand Perry's findings, but add to it and challenge it, creating a more complete theory that accounts for the development of oppressed subjects. That is, women could comparatively evaluate a male-centric theory with a female-centric theory and develop a more nuanced and complete theory of human development. And they got there through epistemic privilege, according to feminist standpoint theory. So that's something that goes beyond our textbook, and if you have any questions about it, don't hesitate to email me. So we've been looking at feminist epistemology, what the limits of knowledge are for men and women. Now let's consider Carol Gilligan's feminine ethics of care. So again, just like we did before, let's start by talking about the research that Gilligan was responding to, which again can be seen as a lopsided theory developed by a male researcher who lacked epistemic privilege because of his standpoint as a male living and working in a time when men oppressed women. So psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg developed a theory of how it is that people develop a sense of morality. And it starts with level 1, the pre-conventional. At this stage, a human is concerned with obedience and punishment. The subject asks himself, how can I avoid punishment? In other words, power is of the utmost concern. Good is what the person with the most power says is good, and the subject tries to abide by the rules to avoid punishment. Stage 2 can be called self-interest orientation. At this level, the subject is concerned with what's in it for me. People start to value reciprocity at this point, and we start to associate right and wrong with pleasure and pain. Stage 3 is conventional morality, where we start to think of others. We start to associate good and bad with how well it pleases or harms others. Stage 4, we are concerned with authority, law, and order. We think that respecting authority, obeying laws and order, and performing our duties is good for its own sake. And then we enter post-conventional morality at stage 5. We still appreciate and abide by moral principles, but we think they should be valid in and of themselves. In other words, we don't accept a moral principle because we're asked to by an authority. We accept a moral principle because it appears to be justified when we evaluate it. It seems like, for instance, duty ethics starts to really take shape here. For instance, one might adopt the deontologist argument that we should never, under any circumstances, use another person as a means to an end. And the reason we do that is for all the reasons that Kant provided. You know, we test those reasons and we either accept them or reject them, and the theory as a whole. So finally, in stage 6, we see ethical principles as abstract and universal. That is, we don't see ethical principles as being human inventions tied to a place and a time, but we see them as applicable to all people at all places and at all times. Now, if we look at Kohlberg's theory from the perspective of feminist standpoint theory, we will realize that Kohlberg ultimately justified the history of ethics in Western philosophy, which has been developed by men. We ultimately end up with a conclusion that someone has reached the highest level of moral development when they have intuited Kant's categorical imperative, or John Locke's social contract theory, or John Stuart Mill's utilitarian moral principle, or another ethical principle forwarded by philosophers as abstract, timeless, and eternal, which is the goal of philosophy since as early as Plato, to reach abstract, timeless, eternal truths. Carol Gilligan, who is coming from the standpoint of an oppressed academic and psychologist, was able to offer a perspective that Kohlberg overlooked given his situation. And she's able to compare and contrast their theories. She saw his theory as representing a justice approach. The subjects of Kohlberg's study were all boys, and they insist on following rules and receiving what is theirs by right. His theory also minimizes the role of feelings and emotions in moral thinking. Gilligan argued that girls think differently. Girls follow a care approach. That is, girls try to resolve differences through compromise so as to maintain friendly relationships. There's also a focus on feelings and emotions like compassion, sympathy, love, and concern in a care approach. So Gilligan argued that caring people can rely on their feelings, emotions, and natural impulses rather than on rules and principles when deciding what is the right thing to do in a given situation. Given its focus on relationships and the feelings, emotions, and natural impulses of people in relations to one another, the care approach tends to be more sensitive to the needs and suffering of others. Gilligan argued that for this reason, women have tended to be very competent in caring for weak, helpless, and vulnerable people. Now, many feminists argue that we shouldn't just accept that boys and girls moralize differently. Remember that females may have an epistemic privilege because they are oppressed subjects, which can help them understand things about ethics that are true and important. So many feminists argue that for the ideal of androgyny, a melding of gender norms and roles, and this would suggest that the traits that make women caring individuals should be encouraged in the upbringing of boys. The justice approach, for instance, tends to think of people as if they were in social isolation and they were performing a calculation and deriving a conclusion about how they ought to act. We definitely see that with utilitarianism. They literally try to quantify pleasure and pain and do a calculation and figure out what's right or wrong. But that's not reflective at all of our lived experiences, and it doesn't account for the importance of maintaining healthy relationships. And that's where a care ethics can be valuable. So we're looking at a possible synthesis here, which means we wouldn't want to discount an ethics of justice completely. It does, after all, correctly indicate that we are autonomous agents who must make certain rules in order to get along. However, by integrating an ethics of care into our moral understanding and development, we would also acknowledge that we're all in a network of relationships with other people, and it's important to encourage close attachments within the group. Let's consider an example from a textbook that I've used before when teaching ethics. And the example is called The Case of Killing the White Crow. And for those of you who are familiar with the recent case of Walter James Palmer, the U.S. dentist who killed Cecil the lion, a prize lion in Zimbabwe's Hwange National Park in July of 2015, you'll find this case study relevant. So Roger Rigterink uses a striking example to illustrate the difference between the justice approach and the care approach. In 1988, a hunter shot a very rare white crow in Wisconsin, and many people were upset. For example, Jo Ann Munson said, quote, "I was angry about it when I first heard of it, and I still am. I don't understand why someone feels the need to shoot a bird like that. It should have been left in the wild for us all to enjoy." End quote. Apparently, the bird was well known and popular with both adults and children in the area. The hunter was unapologetic. When criticized, he responded, quote, "I'm a hunter. It's fair game. The opportunity presented itself. People blow these things out of context. I have been seeing it for a long time. I wanted it for a trophy." End quote. Rigterink points out that there was no law prohibiting hunters from shooting the white crow. Rigterink asked his students whether the hunter had done anything wrong. Many students claim that the hunter hadn't done anything wrong. He had a legal right to shoot the crow because there was no law against it, and it was not morally wrong for him to do what he had a legal right to do. Presumably, the hunter thought the same thing. Rigterink believes that this response illustrates a justice approach to moral decision-making because it appeals to rules and rights. On the other hand, many students also said that the hunter was thoughtless, insensitive, and a jerk. If they concluded that his killing the white crow was wrong because it was insensitive and thoughtless, they were employing a care approach. Applying the care approach, they might have said that killing the white crow was wrong because a caring person would not have killed it. Even with no law prohibiting shooting the white crow, a caring person would recognize that shooting it, in order to have its dead body for a trophy, would cause suffering to other people who value the crow as a very special creature. Both children and adults would feel resentment, anger, sadness, and a sense of loss. Only a person who thinks primarily and exclusively of his or her own wants and needs would shoot the crow. Rigterink claims that the case of the white crow demonstrates a real difference between a justice and a care approach, in part because the two approaches yield incompatible conclusions in this case. He assumes that although the hunter's killing of the white crow was wrong from a care perspective, it was not wrong from a justice perspective. But is he correct from a justice perspective it was morally acceptable for the hunter to kill the white crow? Rigterink seems to assume that the hunter had a moral right to kill the crow simply because he had a legal right to do so. However, a legal right to do something doesn't entail a moral right to do it. In some societies, men have had a legal right to beat their wives, and whites have had a legal right to enslave blacks, but the existence of such laws doesn't require us to concede a moral right to those things. Therefore, the fact that the hunter had a legal right to kill the crow does not necessarily show that he had a moral right to shoot it, nor does the fact that he did nothing legally wrong show that he did nothing morally wrong. In fact, a careful application of such justice approaches as utilitarianism and Kantian moral theory would probably yield the same conclusion as a care approach. For instance, an act utilitarian would probably conclude that more total well-being would result if the white crow were not shot than if it were shot and stuffed for the benefit of one hunter. A Kantian applying the universal law formulation of the categorical imperative might maintain that the hunter could not will that a maxim permitting him to destroy for his own benefit that things that other people enjoy and value become a universal law. Applying the respect for persons formulation of the categorical imperative, a Kantian might maintain that killing the rare and special white crow is incompatible with treating with respect other people who value and enjoy that crow. So the case of the white crow does not demonstrate a significant difference between a justice and a care approach because either approach would yield the same conclusion. So the argument, and I'm done reading from that textbook now, but the argument is that a justice approach and a care approach are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist. After all, we could use utilitarian ethical principles, which would align with the justice approach, to condemn the killing of the crow. Indeed, Gilligan's theory is closely aligned with utilitarianism. Encouraging close attachments within groups and coming up with solutions that benefit a network of relationships often involves creating the most happiness for the most amount of people. So it can be the case that you come to the same conclusion using a justice or a care approach. But the important thing is that both a justice perspective and a care perspective are considered. Importantly, this means weighing the appeal to the universal that a justice approach requires with the appeal to the particular situation that the particular situation and the people involved that a care approach requires. Okay, so let's consider another care ethics example from one of my former teachers at San Jose State University, Rita Manning. And she uses an example from one of Aesop's fables. A group of moles has spent the summer industriously digging a comfortable burrow. When the winter's first icy blasts come, a porcupine begs to be admitted into their burrow for the winter. If the moles let the porcupine in, they'll be less comfortable. The burrow will be overcrowded, and the porcupine's sharp quills will often jab them. Now, Manning asks her students, what should the moles do, and why? Should they let the porcupine in, save its life, or at least save it from extreme discomfort, while making their life less comfortable? And Manning asked her students what the moles should do. And she classified her students' justifications in terms of 5 categories. First, virtues and vices. Many students argued that laziness is a vice and it should be penalized, and hard work should be rewarded. So the porcupine shouldn't be allowed in because the porcupine was lazy and didn't create its own home for the winter, whereas the moles did. And by punishing the porcupine, you inspire it to, take more care next time, basically. Second, moral principles. Different moral principles she heard included like you should alleviate suffering, you should honor your commitments, you should protect life, you should honor property rights. This would be a principle inspired by John Locke's social contract theory. You should maximize utility, and that would be like a utilitarian principle. Or you should help one another. These are all the you should things. That's what moral principles are. Third, reciprocity. Many students argue that you should help those who will be in a position to do the same for you later. So they should help the porcupine so long as the porcupine can help them later. Fourth, self-interest. People should help themselves first, and quote unquote, my group is more important than any other group. And fifth, care. Many people tried to construct a compromise that would allow them to accommodate everybody. So Manning identified these first 4 justifications as related to the justice approach. They conceived of the issue in terms of yes or no, or right or wrong, and came up with justifications for either letting the porcupine in and enduring the quills, or leaving the porcupine out in the cold. Manning identified the last approach as a care approach. She argued that using this approach, the person strives to use their imagination to find a way in which the needs and comfort of both the moles and the porcupine can be accommodated. So, for instance, they might contend that the porcupine should be allowed in on the condition that it helps dig into the burrow and enlarge it so that they can all be comfortable in it. Now, not all cases allow for a compromise like this. Sometimes you need to make a decision that will harm some and not harm others. However, a caring person, according to Manning, will still strive to find a suitable compromise. This means that a justice approach and a care approach won't always differ in their conclusions, but the care approach will include creative thinking in hopes of finding a compromise. So there is a difference between them, even as they might come to the same conclusions. According to Gilligan, this comes naturally to women as a result of their psychology and how they approach morality. It might also be a result of nurture and how they were raised. From Gilligan's epistemic privilege, she was able to develop a more complete picture of moral philosophy than men have been able to do with their justice approach, which is limited. Okay, that ends our week's lecture. So let me know if you have any questions about about this lecture or about the week's reading. Also, I posted prompts for your final paper in the middle of last week, and if you have any questions about the prompt or what's expected of you for that final paper, don't hesitate to contact me. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to interacting with you all this week.